You're listening to the Spirits Blind Tasting Podcast with Johnny Michelson.
Hey guys, it's Johnny here from Spirits People. Thank you so much for checking out this week's episode of the Spirits Blind Tasting Podcast, a podcast dedicated to tasting fine spirits without the influence of brands and marketing. So we're at episode 7 of season 2 and we're way into January 2020 now. And I'm glad to be able to record a bunch of these episodes now ahead of time and also create a little bit more of an outlook for you guys so you can see what's coming ahead. And before I jump into this episode, just wanted to mention again that for you guys wanting to see what's coming ahead on the podcast, but also on my live streams here on YouTube, if you're watching the episode here on YouTube, you can subscribe to my newsletter. So the Curious Drinkers newsletter, access that on spiritspeople.com, sign up and get an email twice a month. And for anyone wanting to see a little bit more about what's happening here on Spirits People, that's a good place to start. You can also join me on Patreon over on patreon.com/spiritspeople. And over there, you will also get access to the monthly update plus another video exclusive look at what's happening behind the scenes here at Spirits People. And also there will be some giveaways throughout the year and some coins like these here. If you're watching on YouTube or follow me on Instagram, you'll have seen my Patreon exclusive coins, and there'll be a lot more stuff like that happening over the course of this year as well. So with that said, a huge thank you, of course, goes out to my Patreon community who is supporting me and my efforts here in creating the podcast and also the videos that I do in my live streams and stuff like that. So thank you so much for your support. It really does mean a lot to me. And of course, it means that the podcast here is maintained an advertisement-free zone. So I think with that said, we'll jump into this week's episode. And of course, as per usual, I've been nosing and tasting the spirit here ahead of time, and I have it poured here in my tasting glass with, of course, my little coin sitting on top to maintain those aromas in the glass throughout this episode. And of course, I still do not know what this is. I'll reveal it to myself at the end of this episode, but you guys will see in the title of the episode and the description below who has provided me with this sample that I have here, and of course what it is that I'm drinking. So you can follow along if you want, or if you just want to listen in not knowing what it is and guess along with me, then by all means feel free to do so. So with that said, let's jump into the episode. I'll kick off with the nosing and the appearance. Let's do it. Right, we're ready with the appearance and the nose here of this week's spirit. And if you're watching here, you can see me holding up the glass here. So this is a clear spirit. There's no kind of haziness or anything like that, although it is a little bit chilly in the room, which sometimes if you're drinking something that is non-chill filtered, you'll be able to get a little bit of a haziness in the glass. However, there's none of that here. If you want to try to get a hazy spirit, try to get a non-chill filtered anything really, and then put a little bit of ice in there and see what happens. See if you can get it to cloud up a little bit. It's a fun little experiment for the home casual drinker, if you will. So going into the intensity and the color of this spirit here, it is a medium gold. So it's a nice golden color in the glass, and the intensity is about a medium. It is not as deep as some other spirits that I've seen. However, it is quite dense in the glass here. The suggested texture, as I do like to get a sense of the kind of viscosity that you could see in the glass, although doesn't necessarily mean anything until you compare it to how it feels on the palate. But I think we're looking at something that's about a medium plus. It is actually quite thick in the glass. So yeah, we'll obviously have a look at that when we hit the palate and see how that's reflected in the mouth as well. But yeah, it would assume, or it would look like at this point, that it is quite a viscous spirit altogether. So jumping into the nose. Smells amazing. This smells so good. It is a clean nose. There's no faulty aromas or anything like that coming out of the glass, and the intensity here is a medium, smack in the middle. As you hit the bottom of the nose, you get all of the aromas out of the glass, like nothing kind of in your face. So it's not like a pronounced intensity here, but also not like quite subdued as some spirits can be. So this here is like very much in the middle of things. So in terms of the aroma characteristics here, I think it revealed itself pretty obvious to me at the very beginning of nosing this, in terms of what category we're looking at. So the first things that came out of the glass was this sensation of apple cider. The apple note was very, very pronounced out of the glass, but it had a sharp sensation associated with it. So apple cider, I kind of find that that's the best way to describe that. If you have a better way of describing that kind of sharp, not necessarily vinegary sensation, because it's not vinegary, that would be an off note and probably also leave the condition to be faulty or something like that. But at this point, it's that kind of sharp note that sits with the apple. Apple cider is what comes to mind for me personally. But yeah, if you have another way and better way to explain it, please do let me know in the comments here if you're watching, or just reach out to me on any of the social platforms. The following note is quite interesting because it had this sawdust sensation, so quite dry, and a woody note that wasn't necessarily oaky or anything like that, or not oaky, charry or dark as something that's been burnt. So it wasn't a sensation of the barrel aging of this. However, it was quite a dry sensation. So sawdust is kind of how I'm positioning that note. So those two were kind of the overall sensation that came up front. And then following that, a lot of other things, which for me personally will conclude the category of malt whiskey. So we're moving into quite a yeasty profile here up front. There's a little bit of wheat bread, some baked bread potentially there. And then there's this bitter sensation that for me is best described as a blood orange, potentially even the pith of a regular orange. So it's the orange sensation, but the bitter aspect of that orange is coming through. So those notes all together is kind of it's a very sharp and dry and very particular aspect of a aroma profile. But then after that is also some other aspects of the aroma that makes it a little bit more sweet. So I'm getting some sultanas, I'm getting some vanillas, and then at the very end there's a little bit of a fragrant note that's lingering, which in the lack of better terms I'll call nail varnish, because it is quite sharp. Nail varnish, I could call it perfume or something like that. It's quite sharp. It feels like it's the ethanols trying to come out of the glass pretty quick, but it could just be me aggravating the spirit by swirling the glass there. So whether or not that's a true representation of the aroma profile here, I'm not sure, but I was getting that little bit of a whiff of ethanol at the end there. So yeah, I think an interesting note here, or an observation, if you will, is that when I was nosing it at the very, very first time, it came off as a little bit standoffish. It wasn't presenting itself very nicely, if you will, or at least that was my experience. Like almost like the apple cider and the sawdust kind of sensation combined at the very beginning of me trying to nose this wasn't actually that pleasant. But I will say, after warming it up a little bit, and obviously you can if you're using a stemmed glass, you can kind of just put it in and try to heat it up, and also try to maintain the aromas in the glass by using a whiskey coin, or just putting your hand on top of the glass here, just to kind of keep it all in the glass at the same time as you're warming it up, so that when you remove the top, all the aromas from warming up the spirit is going to come at your nose, and you'll get a much better representation of what you have. But at the very beginning, it was a bit sharp, and I will say that the apple cider note made me think about almost like a cider vinegar. And I did think for a split second that, hey, this could be a faulty spirit, which I haven't actually had on the podcast here. I haven't had anything that's been coming across as faulty. But I think after just leaving it for a bit, warming it up, it did balance out, and it did actually blend in those notes with the other notes that I was talking about, and it just works. It just works as a total profile. But yeah, sometimes this happens, and the best thing you can do is just leave it for a bit, let it breathe, warm it up, and see what happens. Obviously, if you're still getting vinegar notes and stuff like that, like, it could be that it's actually faulty, and just not been good. And this could be because of air getting into the bottle, or bad cork, or something like that. So anyway, I think in terms of the ABV here, is the last thing before we jump into the palate, I'll say probably around 45 to 50%. I wasn't necessarily 100% sure whether or not I wanted to bump it up a little bit, because it did feel like it has more power than it gives away, and as many other spirits could potentially go either or. I think last week we were looking at something that presented itself quite promising on the nose, but then it was a little bit of a letdown on the palate. But I think we're looking at something that's a little bit on the opposite side of the spectrum here, where I think it's hiding a little bit on the nose, and we'll talk about the palate in a second, where it gives away a little bit more of the profile overall. So yeah, I'll say 45 to 50 just based on the nose, and then we'll reassess it when we hit the palate. And yeah, so I think that's it, and we will do exactly that. Let's get into some tasting notes, and yeah, see you in a bit. Alright guys, we're back with some tasting notes, and I did decide to take a little bit of a longer break, because as I was tasting this again and nosing it again after just recording the appearance in the nose section here, I felt that it had evolved even more. So I decided to give it a little bit more breathing room to see how far I could take it, obviously without losing my connection with the spirit and leaving it for too long, because I do want to have a format here that is not completely disconnected for you guys. But I did let it sit for about 20-25 minutes, and kind of just went back and forth through it, like nosing, tasting, etc. And what I found is that the nose has further evolved and become even more pronounced. Like overall, it's really beautiful. And I'll say the intensity that I said before was a medium on the nose. I think if you were to let it sit and just do it now, I think it's probably around the pronounced aspect of that scale, because I could, if I take the lid off here, I could probably smell it from a distance. Not necessarily as some other spirits will just kind of present itself from across the room, but I think it's opening up and it's just taking its time to really present itself. So yeah, I gave it a little bit of time, but let's jump into the tasting notes here. So the palate, in terms of the sweetness level, I think it's a dry spirit. I don't think there's any sugar being added to it. The intensity on the palate is pronounced, which is what I would have expected from it, but I was very pleased that it actually was pronounced, and it's a really, really nice connection from the nose into the palate. So beautifully linked, if you will. We'll talk about the journey that this spirit is taking me on here, because it is actually really, really nice, and it just had to open up to really present itself. So in terms of the texture here, it's very warming, it's mouth-filling. The viscosity here is a medium plus, which I think is what we said it was on the visual as well. So it comes across as very, very viscous, very oily in the glass, and it's a beautiful presentation of what it actually feels like in the mouth as well. So the flavor characteristics, I think, again, beautifully linked into the nose. The apple cider note is still present. It's quite malty. It has a charred oak sensation now on the palate. It's a little bit leathery, and it has some black peppercorns and potentially even some cloves in there, kind of lingering. There's some bitter notes that are kind of interchangeably linked, if you will. But yeah, the oak, leather, and then peppercorns is kind of the three aspects that I'm able to pick out quite distinctively. So in terms of some things I just jotted down here that I'll share with you guys is that interestingly, as I tasted it, although I was expecting it to be quite a voluminous spirit, it was actually more pronounced than I thought it would be. So I thought it was. So I was actually quite surprised when I tasted this for the first time, because it was just a blast of flavor. It was so intense, and it just made me really, really happy because whatever this is, and we'll obviously, you guys will know, but I'll find out in a few minutes. Whatever this is something that is straight up my alley, and I'm pretty sure it's not something that I have in my cabinet. So whatever sample this is, I'll try and see if I can get at least a few more samples of it, and maybe even buy a bottle, because this I find is something that I would truly enjoy just sitting and sipping on without having to analyze it like I'm doing right now. So yeah, so very pleasantly surprised, if you will, or I wasn't. It's also the wrong thing to say, because I was expecting it to be nice and pronounced, but it was just even more than I thought it would be. So jumping into the finish. So the last thing here, so the finish is very long as well. There's some complexity. So it's quite malty and it's quite oaky, and there's those kind of bitter notes like peppercorns, and there's some leathery notes as well. It's more malty on the finish than it is on the actual palate. So again, I think we're looking at something that's a single malt. I think with everything that I've talked about here, I think a single malt is really all that I can conclude. So if this is something different, I'll be very surprised. But obviously blind tasting can give you some surprises, as we saw a few episodes back where it was a bit off, if you will. But yeah, so it feels like a single malt to me, and a good quality here as well. So we'll get to that in a second. So finally, the ABV, I think from the nose, where it kind of came across as, I said 45 to 50 up front, but then after leaving it for a while, I think it feels like it has more power on the nose. So I think that, combined with how it feels on the palate, I think it's probably higher than that, so maybe above the 50 mark. So I'll say around 55, or at least that's kind of how it comes across. But if it's around 50, I wouldn't be surprised, because sometimes what tricks me is the volume of aromas and flavors. I tend to connect that with ABV, which is not true, or it's not something that's a certainty, at least. Like, it can be true, but it's not something that's like, oh, if it has more volume, it has a higher ABV. It doesn't work that way. But obviously it's a mind trick. So yeah, if it was lower, I wouldn't be too surprised, but I think it does come across as something that's around the 55 mark. So yeah, I think finally on the quality level here, I was debating whether or not I should put this in the outstanding category. And I think, you know what? I think I will do, because although it had a weird journey of opening up here, I'll say this spirit is one of the key spirits for me that's really proven that when you taste something and know something for the first time, it has absolutely nothing to do with the full representation of what you're about to experience. So as I said, the first nosing of this was almost off-putting, and I was about to evaluate whether or not I thought it was a faulty spirit. However, it just needed time to open up, and maybe also it's a bit too cold in the room. So after warming this up and really just letting it sit, it's just blossomed. So I think I will actually put it in the outstanding category, although I'm not sure what, because I'm following the WSET format here, so I'm not sure what the sense is in terms of judging something on the basis of just the final output, or if you have to judge it from the very beginning. I'm not actually sure, but I'm going to put it in the outstanding category because I think that's where it's ended up for me personally. And then in terms of my guess, I think it's probably a cask strength single malt. I was debating whether or not it's just something that's high proof, but I do think that is probably a cask strength, and maybe around, I mean, the color itself, and this is where it becomes tricky because color doesn't mean anything on its own, but I think now with everything else, I'll put it at maybe 15, maybe a little bit younger, maybe 12 to 15 years old, cask strength, single malt, and yeah, I'll leave it with that. In terms of the different, I'm just looking at my notes here in terms of like the cask, the type of cask, but I'm just not sure at this point, because it was a lot of strange notes combined. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I'm not even sure if the cask is going to be revealed on the cards that I have here, but I'll say that's it for the tasting notes. I'll jump in and I'll do the reveal to myself and share it with you guys in a split second. So let's do it. Alright guys, we're back with the reveal, and this is, of course, and I'll just show it here to you guys on video. So the note here says that this is a 2005 Ben Riach, and this is a 12-year-old PX cask at 56%. And it has a hash number here, which I'm assuming is a barrel number. So I'm just assuming this is a single barrel as well. So barrel 5279. And yeah. Very interesting. I absolutely love this. This was so good. And I'm just fascinated at this point still on how it just came across as off-putting at the very, very beginning of this episode. And it's just developed in the glass, given air, given heat. And now it's ended up being something I found absolutely outstanding. So yeah. That's what can happen. And also to mention, finally here, so this sample is graciously donated to me by my good friend Ian, who's a fellow London Whisky Club member, also better known as Posh Scotch. And I've done a live stream with Ian where we've done some tastings. So if you're watching here on YouTube, I'll drop a link at the end here to that tasting that we did. If you want to check out a little bit more about Ian, you can also follow Ian on Instagram at Posh Scotch. I think it's also his Twitter account. So yeah, absolutely amazing. Ian, thank you so much for sharing this. I very much appreciate it. And yeah, I hope this is a bottle that's somewhat easy to get, because I was very fascinated by this. Or at least maybe you can share another sample. So yeah. I think that's it. Not too bad in terms of my notes and my guess here. I think pretty spot on, 56%. Yeah, not too bad. Cool. I think that's it. I'll close out with a huge thank you again to my Patreon supporters. I love having you guys over in the community. And yeah, I'll be doing some videos for you guys exclusively very, very soon. So have a look out for that. And as I said earlier on, if you want to get a heads up on what's coming ahead, join the newsletter, the Curious Drinkers newsletter on my website, spiritspeople.com. And yeah, the Patreon community is patreon.com/spiritspeople. And finally, which I haven't really been saying that much, if you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to the podcast if you're listening? And if you want to give me a massive pat on the shoulder, leave a review and give me some stars or whatever is available wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, why not subscribe and like this stuff if you like it. If you don't like it, don't like it. And that's it. I've managed to talk again for a few more minutes. And yeah, I think with that said, let's cut this episode and stop talking. And yeah, I hope to see you guys next week. Peace.